Wonderful. Well, we have a lot that we want to hear from our panelists this evening, so we'll just get started, and then as people trickle in, they can join us. So hello, welcome. My name's Sam. I am the DC Science Writers Association president. I am just popping in very briefly right now and very briefly at the end to say hello and to share a couple things with you all. But the person who organized this event is Judith Lavelle. So Judy did so much work on this. I was fully behind the scenes, as I will be today during the panel. So Judy is a science writer and a DCSWA member who writes about substance use research for the National Institutes of Health. So she has produced content for the National Institute on Allergy and Infectious Diseases, for Chemical and Engineering News, for the Boston Globe, Scientific American, 90.9 WBUR, which is Boston's NPR news station. She's done a lot of great things, and she's bringing us an excellent panel today. So Judy will take it away in just a moment. And then a lot of the time today will be spent answering your questions that you have for our panelists. So at any point, you can submit your questions into the Q&A, and then I will be behind the scenes relaying those to Judy so she can take those on and you can get answers to the questions that you have. So Judy, I'm going to turn it over to you and disappear for a minute.
Thank you so much, Sam. Really appreciate all the work that you've been doing behind the scenes. So lived experience can be a pretty broad topic. So I wanted to start off by just setting the scene a little bit about what we're talking about. My interest in this subject has come from over the past few years, more and more newsrooms and professional societies broaching the subject of reporting with lived experience in mind. That is, being open about how our own stories and identities as people contribute to our work, especially in the ways marginalized perspectives can help bring depth and authenticity to stories that others may miss. In the scientific realm, I've noticed a concurrent conversation about me-search, or research on subjects relevant to scientists themselves. Since science and journalism are both professions that value objectivity while also valuing expanding perspectives to discover new things, I've been very curious about how science writers approach subjects that are personal, whether this means writing about a new cancer treatment as a cancer survivor or a toxic chemical spill in one's own community. Not to get too meta, but this subject is also personal for me and a big reason I'm interested in it. As within the last 4 years, I began writing about substance use and addiction science while in active recovery myself. So I'm personally very excited to learn more from our esteemed panelists, who I will introduce now, beginning with Brian Bull, who's joining us all the way from Oregon. Welcome, Brian. Brian works as a reporter and news director for NPR affiliate KLCC in Eugene, Oregon. Brian is a member of the Nez Perce tribe and has blogged about incorporating meaningful indigenous perspectives in environmental reporting. Brian has
for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. Brian has covered diverse topics from disproportionate suicide rates at the Menominee Indian Reservation to indigenous forest burning practices in a popular story featured here. Brian's work expands beyond scientific topics and has aired or appeared on NPR Marketplace, National Native News, _News, The Oregonian, and Indian Country Today. So thank you so much, Brian, for joining us. Next up, I'm excited to welcome fellow DCSWA member Ariana Remmel. Ari is a science journalist, audio producer, and essayist. They use basic science as a way to express and explore their identity, as they did in a wonderfully creative essay featured on NPR Shortwave, where I heard it first, in which they use the organic chemistry concept of resonance to explore their non-binary and multiracial identities. This was one in a series of creative essays for Catapult entitled Better Living Through Chemistry. Ari is currently an assistant editor on the physical sciences desk at Chemical and Engineering News, and their work has also appeared in Nature, Science News, and BirdNote. Thank you so much, Ari, for joining us. It's also a pleasure to welcome Kat Stafford, a national investigative writer at the Associated Press focused on race and inequity. Kat's work includes APs From Birth to Death, which is a really incredible and sweeping series on the impact of health disparities and medical racism on Black Americans across the lifespan. Kat writes on her website that her journalism journey began as she grew up on Detroit's East Side. There, her family put together a community newsletter full of news that residents felt went uncovered by local media. That first exposure to community-driven journalism laid the foundation for a career highlighting under-resourced and ignored Black communities and other communities of color. Thank you so much, Kat, for joining us. And finally, a warm welcome to Apoorva Mandavilli, science and global health reporter for the New York Times. Apoorva currently covers COVID-19, vaccinations, the WHO and the CDC, among other topics. She has filed many stories since the pandemic began on COVID, but I've asked her here today to discuss a piece from April 2022, where she wrote about experiencing COVID firsthand and shared the perspective it brought to her work. So thank you so much for joining us, Apoorva, and thank you again to all of our panelists. And with that, I will get into some questions. So many of you saw the tweet that I shared that Kat had, talking about how her thought process about lived experience in the newsroom has changed over time. So I wanted to ask each of you, what went into informing the decision to talk about lived experience in your work? And had you always thought that that would be part of your work? And if not, what inspired you to start incorporating it in that way? I could ask Apoorva first to start us off. Did you know when you got a positive COVID-19 test that you would write an essay about it to your readers?
I did not. First of all, I was too sick initially and too tired to really think about that. I think COVID really walloped me, but it was really interesting because I had been already at that point writing about COVID for quite a while, had been describing the symptoms, had been talking about how people feel and how long it lasts and what they should, how they should take care of themselves. And then here I was going through it. So it was actually really great to be able to experience that in some ways. I'm an infectious disease reporter, so I've written about, polio and HIV and malaria and TB, and I've had none of those things. So it sort of was different to be writing about something that I was actually experiencing myself. And I like to think that it did add a layer of depth to my reporting from that point on, because if I was talking about like, oh, COVID can make you feel really exhausted, I actually knew what I was talking about instead of just parroting what an expert said. And it was not the first time I'd written about something related to COVID from my perspective, so it felt right.
Thank you, Apoorva. Kat, since you wrote the tweet, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about that journey that you had to thinking of lived experience in a different way, and now thinking of it as more of an asset.
Sure. So for me, like you kind of mentioned in the intro about me, it really started at a young age from growing up in a city like Detroit that has seen its fair share of racial disparities, looking specifically at the 1967 uprisings that occurred and having parents who lived through all of that, along with all of the other socioeconomic conditions that have occurred in Detroit for quite a long time. So growing up and hearing my parents and neighbors and relatives just constantly talk about how they felt that they weren't being represented in the news kind of, I guess, lit a fire in me, to the point that when I got to college, when I became a professional journalist, I knew pretty early on that this was the type of reporting that I wanted to do. The difficulty, though, was navigating newsrooms that were mostly white, that weren't typically used to a reporter who wanted to write about the topics that I was pushing for. And so it was hard navigating that at the start, but throughout my career, I've been able to kind of carve out this place where I got to a point where I realized, no, this is what I want to write about. And my lived experience of being a Black woman coming from one of the nation's largest Black majority cities, this is something that will help elevate my reporting. This is something that I see as a strength in terms of connecting with communities that have been historically excluded from coverage. So my lived experience has been the center, I would say, of a lot of the journalism that I've been able to do thus far.
Thank you so much, Kat. And Brian, I see you went off mute. I was gonna hand it over to you. I know you also work a lot in the marginalized community space. Can you speak to that?
Sure. I'm an enrolled member of the Nez Perce tribe, or as we call ourselves, the Namipu. And my interest in journalism was kind of sparked from a number of very early unpleasant encounters during my childhood and teen years in a very rural conservative area of Idaho, which is a 20-minute diatribe in itself. But I will say that as I got older and began raising a family, became a father, I got involved in more activities both at work and with my children that really, I think, developed my sense of reporting beyond the straight, objective, keep things very separate and neutral. And another facet to my life was, before I became a journalist, I was actually a national park ranger who in the early 90s became a wildfire fighter. I was trained in combating fires. This was 30 years and 50 pounds ago. But, I grew up in a time when the overall prevailing mission for the government was total and complete wildfire suppression. And so I was part of that generation that began to kind of slowly rethink that process. Whereas now we are looking at cultural burns, or as they're more commonly called, controlled burns, prescribed burns that deprive fuels and restore habitats and rejuvenate certain species like sequoias. They require fire to open up their cones and reseed the ground. But at that time, when I was just starting out, it was very foreign, and we were still very much in this century-old mindset: is all fires have to be responded to quickly and suppressed. But more than a century of that policy following colonization drew in a lot of slash and debris and deprived habitat of the restorative fire that they often needed. And so there's kind of a renaissance, I believe, in rethinking fire, not as a destructive force, but more as a tool, something that could be utilized to improve the environment. And I'm happy to say that in the last few years, as I've been doing more and more reporting on this from a former wildfire fighter and indigenous perspective, that people are really coming around to rethinking that, including a number of state and federal government agencies. So it's been a learning process, and the journey has just begun for me.
Thank you, Brian. A great example of solutions journalism too, which I know DCSWA has done a lot on as well. Ari, what about you? How did the decision to write so explicitly about personal experience in essay form come about?
Yeah, so I will be the first to say that the column that I wrote for Catapult, I would not describe as being journalism per se, but it was a reported essay process. For those of you who haven't read the column, there's I kind of interweave these elements of like what I learned as a chemist back when I started out as a research chemist before going into journalism, and then using the tools from that set of language to help to interpret and explain my own lived experience that can be described under a number of different terms. But I guess that because of this essay style, what I will say is that I had no choice but to write that piece. I needed to for myself. The choice was in when and in what way I wanted to share it, if at all, right? And this was a process that for me, I think that as coming from a journalistic background, having this love of sharing with an audience, I write because I want to communicate with a reader who is receptive to the story that I'm telling. If no one reads it, then really what's the point? But ultimately the decision to be as vulnerable with that part of my life came out of a recognition from my colleagues and friends that this was something that was actually useful, that added kind of, again, a different tool set. Not a lot of people are using chemistry, literally the nitty gritty of organic chemistry, to talk about gender or being multiracial, for example. So nowadays, as a reporter at Chemical and Engineering News, my day-to-day is writing about quantum chemistry and astrochemistry. There's not a lot of gender in space yet. So I don't feel like I used that as much in my specific journalism work. However, having that perspective as part of a larger newsroom means that I feel like I can participate in these conversations that happen behind the scene that readers aren't always privy to, about making sure that we as a group not only as individual reporters and editors, but in the structure of how a newsroom produces content, that I can help contribute that experience so that our readers feel more seen in the way that we write our stories.
Wonderful. So I'm hearing a lot about reactions within the newsroom, reactions of readers. I think you're so right, Ari. Why share these things if we don't expect people to read them? So I'm curious about what folks have gotten as reactions to their work, whether that's from editors in the pitching process or from readers after things have been posted. Any memorable reactions on your pieces?
After my piece,
go
go
ahead.
ahead. I was going to say
Please.
after my piece about having COVID came out, there were two, well, really three kinds of reactions, I suppose. One was like, I don't care. Why are you writing this? One was, I'm glad you wrote this. I felt very similarly. Thank you for, giving voice to the kind of things that I experienced. And then the third kind was people who were angry that I didn't use the platform, as it were, to talk about long COVID. Because in the piece, I say something like, I wasn't particularly worried about long COVID because I was vaccinated. And that's actually true. Your risk does go down, but they didn't like that. They felt like I was dismissing long COVID. And so there was a lot of backlash to that. So it felt like, oh, it can't just be about your experience. You have to also, I don't know, pretend that you feel something differently for a greater purpose. And I didn't think that was accurate.
I did a video, which you showed earlier on in the slide there, Judith, about how these ancient Native American prescribed burns, or cultural burns as they're called, were being revisited and brought back. And I did a video. Thankfully, I was given exclusive access to this practice. They had the event with, I think, a few dozen firefighter trainees and a number of agencies, and I was the only journalist invited to come along because I demonstrated, I think, cultural sensitivity and respect to the process. And it was a 7-minute video that I did initially for KLCC, but I found out since from a number of people, including watershed councils across the region and a number of agencies and Oregon State University, that the video has actually been widely circulated. And a lot of people have come up to me after that video was produced and posted to say, thank you so much for really establishing a sense of trust and respect for this practice, because they were very concerned that it could be a very sensationalistic piece. It could be like, oh no, people are setting fire to the forest, and what's that about? That's crazy. All these things that I think they were afraid of came through very constructively and educated an audience that was had perhaps never been invited to rethink fire as a practical tool and not the demonic force that it's often portrayed in old Hollywood film and TV shows. And so, whereas I was initially worried about, seeing if this might compromise any editorial independence or integrity on my part, it actually really, I think, bridged a lot of trust and communication between our station and a lot of these agencies and tribes that were featured in that video. So I was very happy to see the positive return.
I guess for me, I'll use the project that just published in May. It was From Birth to Death. That was what we called it. And it was essentially examining how generations of Black Americans have faced just a numerous amount of health inequities throughout the course of life, starting at birth. And we looked at it as each chapter of life, kind of birth, childhood, teen years, adulthood, and then elder, final years. And a lot of the reaction, it was across the board. There were folks who were very upset that the Associated Press devoted over a year worth of resources into this. They said racism doesn't exist. These health inequities, that they are just folks' own individual problems. So we got that. Then there was just a lot of reaction, more so reaction from a lot of Black folks who were just like, wow, I cannot believe something like this was published at the AP. I see myself, I see my mother's story in that last story about Alzheimer's. I experienced this problem when I gave birth to my child. So that reaction kind of solidified for me that this type of work is important. And the way that I came up with this project was because of growing up in the city of Detroit and seeing these health inequities play out in front of me with relatives, folks that I just knew, but also throughout the course of reporting jobs that I had prior to coming to the AP. So the reaction has been amazing. And I just think that for me, it just served as another reminder that, you know, this type of work, amplifying, centering folks at the heart of stories like this, of science, of health stories is important. And, you know, one thing I want to add is, yes, we're talking about lived experiences that helped inform the reporting, but what also made the reporting strong was the data, the research, the statistics. You know, this was a project where I was the lead writer for 4 of the 5 stories. I wrote 4 of the 5 stories, but we had data folks on this. We had graphics. We did fact checks. This was fact-based reporting that just happened to be informed by my personal experience and the personal experiences of others. But we treated this project as you would any other journalism project. And I think that helped bulletproof us from that reaction that we got from that first bucket of folks that accused us of being fake. Well, how can you dispute decades of research that shows that this is an actual problem that generations of Black Americans have been experiencing? So I would say the power in using your lived experiences, coupling it with the research, the interviews, and everything that you would do with any other story that makes it undeniable.
Yeah, so in terms of the essay project that we kind of introduced, that I started with, the reception was generally wonderful. In fact, lots of people have invited me to come and talk to them about that, and that's great. I think that truthfully, the community that I was most nervous about the reception for was other chemists. I came to that piece really strongly, kind of with my identity still embedded in this idea of like, I am a chemist who now does communication. And I was really worried that active researchers were going to come at me with comments about, not using the wrong definition for something like delocalized versus aromatic or whatnot, right? These ended up being not real concerns ultimately. But, I think that when we write from the perspective of a lived experience, I expect folks, I'm from Little Rock, Arkansas. There's a reason I left here at one point or another. I expect folks to not use my pronouns or to try to decide what my ethnicity should be. But there's something really scary about putting myself out there, not as a representative of my community, but in a position where I might be the only one that someone else has seen before. So I guess kind of a different example of a reported essay that I did. I'm a birder, which means I go and spend a lot of time with birds. And I did a reported essay for Audubon last year about current efforts to remove eponymous names, the names of birds that are named after people. Many of these people have really very problematic histories that are monuments to that past embedded in the way that we talk about these birds today. And it's not a burden that they should have to bear, nor the community of birders who are really empowered to protect the environment now, right? And so some of the comments, again, that I expected to get back from people who do not participate in this world of ornithology and field ID to come at me and say, oh, what does it matter what we call these birds? But I did have some backlash from active ornithologists and other people here in my birding community in Little Rock, Arkansas, who felt really personally attacked that I was taking away some part of our history, some part of the history that I shared. I live in my hometown. So, in terms of how I think about reception, I do think that at the end of the day, as long as I feel like I have done my due diligence as a journalist, that I am telling the truth in the writing that I present and the evidence that I share and in the perspectives that I incorporate, I think Kat's exactly right. The lived experience of the individual writer becomes part of a larger project. And that's ultimately what I have to do. And the other thing is, if I do make a mistake, and I'm sure that at some point in this process I will, one writing piece is part of a larger conversation with our audience, right? And we can use experiences that we have in our reporting to continue to build that trust as is needed in order to do our jobs, to tell the stories that need to be told.
Well put, thank you. So we started to have some great questions coming in from the audience. So I'll share one now, which is, has there been a time where a topic has been challenging or difficult to write about because of personal lived experience? And how did you move forward or handle your next steps? I'm interpreting that as being difficult to write about, maybe emotionally, but could also be just maybe lived experience gets in the way of understanding something. I don't know. So does that ring a bell for anybody?
Sure. I mean, so actually you showed the piece about me having COVID, but there were a couple other things that I wrote that I think are probably more, I relate to them more with what Kat and Ariana were just talking about, because they really were based in data and science, even though they were personal and told from a personal perspective. So one example that I can very clearly remember sort of wrestling with is the decision to send my kids back to school. So if you all remember, in 2020, it was like everybody was trying to sort of figure out, is it safe, is it not? And there were a lot of people who had preconceived notions of what I personally thought, even though I was only reporting on the topic. There were a lot of people who still blame me for the schools in the country being closed. But so, you know, my editors thought it would be interesting, because I have 2 kids myself, to write about how you make the decision to send your kids back to school. So I sort of walked readers through my own process. And because I had done so much research on this topic, I had written about so many studies, and I was talking to scientists all the time, I sort of really did it in a very systematic way. Like, I thought about these studies that show X and these studies that show Y. And then at the end, I actually said, you know, but I decided to send my kids back to school. And the number one thing was because rates in New York were low at the time. So it was like, there was all rooted in science and research, but it was still very challenging to write because emotions were so high. And it felt like everything that I wrote, everything about that anyone wrote about schools was creating such a firestorm. And I was getting so much hate mail for anything on either side. Close schools, don't close schools, it doesn't matter. Somebody was going to hate it. And so that felt really challenging. Like, here I am writing about this very explosive topic and talking about my own decision. And I knew that people would come after me and say, like, either I'm being really irresponsible sending my kids back to school and I'm putting them in, you know, at death's door, or there'd be people saying I was a hypocrite and you wrote this other study about blah, blah, blah. So it's definitely difficult to put yourself in a story, because you're getting rid of that layer of journalistic objectivity or distance that you can normally, you know, that normally protects you to a certain extent from having you dissected and not just what you write. And so that felt, it was, you know, it was very vulnerable for me. I felt very vulnerable doing that. But at the same time, I think that the reason my editors wanted me to write it, and the reason I did write it, and, you know, I think it was well received for the most part, except by people who hated me, was because everyone was wrestling with it. And I think everyone felt vulnerable and scared and terrified. Like, am I making the right decision? Am I doing something horrible to my kids? And so it was like I was there with them and as a part of it, and not just like looking on from some neutral zone where nothing really affected me.
On a related note, I did a story for KLCC and a publication called Underscore here in Oregon a couple years back in the midst of the pandemic. And there was obviously a lot of debate going on about whether or not to get the vaccines and what was safe. And it just seems to be argument without end. But my story had to do with how tribes had largely coordinated together to organize clinics and get their members vaccinated. And this is from a community, a Native community that had every reason to distrust the government through reservation policies and broken treaties and the forced sterilization of women back in the 70s. There's just been a lot to accommodate, but I found that I had challenges in working with some of the Native organizations and getting to disclose information about clinics as to how many vaccines they were administering. And it was interesting. I eventually just had to go around the back door, so to speak, and work with federal data, basically to find out how much money had been allocated and try to get, vaccination amounts. I got the story, but I was kind of surprised at the pushback I was getting from some of the organizations that were responsible for holding clinics. And one person said to me off the record, so I won't share their name or their organization, that they were concerned of online harassment, that if they were talking openly about the need to vaccinate tribal members to better protect their children and their elders, that trolls would get onto the comments and basically distract from the greater conversation, which is something that I'm still trying to accommodate and understand as, the role of social media and trolling as a force in guiding the conversation. And I understand in many ways why some people leave comments off of their stories and, social media as well.
I would add that for my project, I was not too concerned about honestly the reaction from the public. I knew it was either there was going to be very specific emotions evoked. I expected to get the onslaught of, I got some very racist emails, tweets. I'm still getting them. Not surprised by that. What I was more concerned about, what was the most difficult part of this project, was not the data, not finding the experts, it was finding the people. And I say that because you're talking about a community who, for very good reason, does not trust journalism, just because they feel that they haven't been reflected in a lot of different ways. And there's a lot of different reasons, right? They see us, and sometimes in many ways, as akin to some of the institutions that they don't trust. And I think that's a hard truth that our industry is still grappling with, right? And so gaining the trust of these 5 families from all over the country to tell us about some of the most traumatizing things that they've experienced in their life, and having them open the doors to their homes to take their photos and video and spend just countless days and letting us look at medical records. I mean, that's very invasive. And, a lot of the questions that I got at the start was kind of, well, what's in this for me? Why should I talk to you? So trying to build out a process that I felt was trauma-informed reporting, to allow them the space to process their emotions, process their own stories, and feel like they still had agency while balancing my need to tell this story in a fact-based way. That's difficult. And that's not exactly something that I feel that journalism schools teach us, or taught, at least when I was in school. So that has been the most difficult part of the type of reporting that I do, is trying to find the people who can illustrate why this is a topic that the country or readers should care about, and getting them to the place where they feel like they can talk about it. But also, once they do, to Brian's point, just bracing them for the reaction that they might get. So just walking them through, this is my reporting process, this is the fact-checking process. Okay, now the story is about to publish. Don't read the comments, or if you do, you might see this, but you also might see this. So it goes beyond just the standard level of researching, reporting, interviewing. For me, it's also caring about the sources in a way that I don't feel crosses the line, because at the end of the day, we're humans too, right? Just making sure that they fully understand the process. For me, that's the most difficult part of reporting on topics like this.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up, both of you, Brian and Kat and Apoorva, about dealing with sources, and to what extent is it, I'm curious, to what extent do you bring up your own lived experience with subjects or community involvement when you're kind of establishing a relationship with a source, whether that means, myself telling someone in recovery that I'm also in recovery, or I don't know, Apoorva, when you're asking a scientist, are you saying I'm getting over a case of COVID, and I have some questions for you. I'm curious how each of you has approached that in your reporting.
I do that because I'm also a beat reporter. So most of the people I talk to a lot. So it would be weird actually for me to not talk about that. It's like I think of my reporting a lot as ongoing conversations with, some number of sources. And so it does come up. And I think it also helps me say like, oh, I really want to know this and our readers want to know this. And I think it gives it an extra urgency or heft to be able to say, this isn't just like my fancy or my editor's fancy. Like this is something people really want to know. And here's how I'm coming at it and why I think this is a legitimate thing that people are wondering about. And so it does actually help to open up the conversation a bit. So you're not just having a dry academic discourse about something that really matters to people.
My undergrad degree was in psychology. My initial goal before I got bit by the journalism bug was to become a counseling therapist. And even though I quit halfway through my master's degree in counseling and psychology and switched into broadcast journalism for a career, I still utilize a fair amount of techniques and skills that I learned through that program to get people to open up. And one of the most important ones is disclosure. And so when I talk to a source, assuming I'm not giving away any sensitive information or things that could make me perhaps too vulnerable, I will often share things that I can relate to that person and what their situation may be. There was one case where I was talking to a former prisoner, a former felon, I guess, and they were very wary about how I might use their story and how I might disclose information of their life after being in prison. And I relayed to them that my dad was a parole officer when I was very young for a few years. And once he took me to a visit to the prison there in Washington State, and I got to meet some of the people that he was in charge of and connected to and shared their experience about how they're trying to find lives after they're released and avoid going back into prison. And so it gave me some insights, and I shared those with the source. And almost immediately he felt that I was someone who could be trusted because I spoke to that experience early on and familiarity with the prison system. And so when appropriate and when you're comfortable, I think that little disclosure goes a long ways and can really help bond with a source who may otherwise not be as open with you.
I agree 100%. The first story was focused on infant and maternal health, and we went down to Alabama. We featured two sisters who both had, unfortunately, traumatic experiences at the same university health system. And not a lot of people know this except folks at AP, but during the course of this project, I was pregnant. And so I was sitting there listening to these two sisters, they're crying, they're telling just all these horrible things. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I'm a Black woman too, could I experience this? Is this going to happen to me? And so throughout the course of the project, when they talked about things, I would tell them, well, oh yeah, I know exactly what you're talking about. I went through this, or I saw this happen, and that I think helped kind of form that bond of trust, because those two in particular were very like, ooh, I don't know if I want to share this, it was already something. So, one of the sisters, she almost died. She had maternal sepsis and nearly died, and she just didn't want to relive that. But building up that trust and feeling like I was someone who understood, who got it, who understood culturally some of these things too. I think that to all the points that have been made, that just went a long way. With the second story, I had childhood asthma growing up, and some of the families that we talked to in that piece, they were worried that, will they come across as if they don't have their child's health condition under control? What are people going to think? Because my child has asthma and they have all these asthma attacks, they're in and out of the emergency room, but me being able to share, I understand that. I went through this too as a child. That kind of, let them, I think, put down the walls that they had built up naturally. So I think that there's an artful way to just share your experience with someone. I don't think, again, that that's crossing any sort of line. I just think that that's about approaching journalism, approaching science in a way that is human-centered.
So I want to add something really quick to that, which is that I think it helps even if you don't actually share that other person's exact lived experience. So I think I mentioned earlier, I'm in Jackson and I've been talking to a lot of Black women. I'm not Black, and I could not begin to understand exactly their lived experience, but still being able to say something about how I relate or my own life has some element of it really helps, because I think it also changes the power dynamic. Otherwise, it's like they're telling me all these really deep, intimate things about their own life, and here I am, complete cipher. And I think it evens the score a little bit. It makes people feel more comfortable, like, okay, she shared something and she's a person, and we're having a conversation, rather than she's in a position of power and she can do whatever she wants while I have to reveal everything about myself. And so I think that really does help to build a better, more trusting relationship with sources.
Yeah, I want to follow up on a couple of points that all of the other panelists had made, which is that I'm always open to adding my lived experience to part of the interview conversation, but exactly to, I believe what Brian said, that it has to be in a situation where it is safe and appropriate. I think that following a source's lead as to what they need in order to feel comfortable is really important, because for so many of us, the identities that we inhabit are in flux, and sometimes we need to work on that on our end, and it's not necessarily useful or helpful to bring into the actual conversation with another source who's trying to share their own kind of process. However, I've also had experiences when I've talked to people and said, for example, in dealing with mental health crises, being willing to share, like, this is what my experience is, this is how I feel like I can relate to what you are bringing to this conversation, and then having them be like, okay, but mine is very different, right? And so being able to even be vulnerable enough to offer up a situation and then have someone say, actually, no, let's clarify, let's move forward in a way that is going to be more truthful to their story, and again, ultimately to serve the audience that we are trying to write for. So artful, I think, Kat, is the word that you use. There's a way to develop this skill so that you can be artful in the way that you build trust with that kind of disclosure. Do y'all agree? Does that resonate with everyone else?
Absolutely. You don't want to pretend like you're their friend or you're just having a random conversation either. It has to be relevant. Artful is a great way to put it. Sensitive. Yeah, absolutely.
Empathy, just again, just basic empathy, just the ability to listen and absorb what people are saying. I think there's power in that too, for sure, without inserting or sharing any personal lived experience.
I'm curious. So one of my selfish reasons for putting this together is because something I experience at work, along with empathy and, providing some authenticity or hopefully some insight, is it's so close to you. I'm curious if anyone else feels that it makes them more vulnerable to burnout. And if so, how do you kind of protect yourself from, a wavering work-life balance, even if it does ultimately provide a good to your work? Any tips and tricks, Brian, from your psychology background?
It's certainly good to have an outlet that is not work related. That could be a family, a spouse, a partner, an activity, a hobby, something that just kind of removes you from obsessing over some of these things. I remember back in 2020, after the death of George Floyd at the hands of Minneapolis police, there was a huge uprising, a surge in protests and rallies and vigils that involved a lot of members of the BIPOC community, including myself. And it was very easy for me to associate with a lot of the anger and a lot of the fear that people were having over police brutality and oppression. And then we saw kind of a surge of antipathy against journalists and also kind of a backlash from white supremacists. We had it all happening all across the United States, including here in Oregon. And so it was very easy to be feeling that you were sometimes targeted, very vulnerable. Sometimes you just see the things that happen that create a lot of these protests and criticisms. And it's very easy to get sucked into it and internalize a lot of that. So if you have a circle of confidants could be a good close family member. It could be, again, a partner or just a really good friend. And just a way to not let that ride and corrode at you, because there's so much that you'll be targeted for and you'll hear about that seems unfair and irrational, that you just kind of have to oftentimes stand and take because you don't want to feed the beast either. And so I found that during the pandemic, especially, getting out for daily hikes and just trying to engage with colleagues outside of work and not focus on the job so much were really just kind of my salvation at times. And I think we've all been kind of through similar situations the last 3 years where really kind of felt front and center as this wave of anti-press sentiment came from certain circles within the country.
I agree. I think for me, having a couple circles, right? You know, I have my circle of fellow journalists of color, Black journalists specifically, who we have group chats and we just let it all out there. Everything that you can't tweet, everything that you can't say in your newsroom, it's kind of a safe space, an outlet with people you trust. Then you have the folks who are outside of journalism. They don't understand how any of this works. They get tired of it. And I need that sometimes because they pull me back down to earth and they're like, all right, stop, let's go do this. Let's talk about this, something else. But to Brian's point, just going for walks, watching that trashy reality TV show, maybe, whatever your thing is, do that, embrace that. But also, I think it's important for us to, if you're in a newsroom, if you get to that point, I almost got to that burnout point, in the early days of the pandemic, those early months when the racial disparities were especially stark for COVID. I was doing a lot of the reporting. They asked me to do a story out of Detroit because Detroit was one of those early hotspots. And we were losing pillars of our community, sources, folks that I have known for years were just gone one day. And I was expected to write about that in a way that removes all emotion in a sense, right? And that was hard. That story was the point where I said, okay, I need to take a break. And my point is developing that relationship with your editor. Hopefully you have someone in your newsroom who could back you up, who supports you, who recognizes before you get to that burnout point. But if you don't, building that own sense of confidence for yourself to say, I need to take a day. I need to take 2 days. If you want me to continue to do this type of work, this is what I need. So for me, it was learning how to be my own biggest advocate and having a mentor within the newsroom or having, that relationship with my editor where he understood that was what I needed. For me, that has been what has allowed me to continue to do this work, because this is hard when you're reporting on inequities or just, COVID in general, whatever you're reporting on, it's tough. It weighs on you. And I think it's very crucial to have this system built up before you get to that point of burnout, because we need folks like us to continue to do this work in this industry.
Absolutely. Well said. Another question from the chat.
Sorry, can I add
Oh, yeah,
something to
please.
that as well? Yeah, I mean, I think that, so I come from the perspective of I do not, again, mostly talk about gender or race or neurodivergence in my specific field of computational chemistry. However, I work in a newsroom with other people who do, right? And part of how I have tried to find the balance so that I can really bring my whole self to those stories when I am called to do so is making sure that, number one, I feel like I have trust in my team, right? That the structures are built up ahead of time. But again, the recognition that we are each individual reporters whose bylines are on these stories, but there is a structure, there is an institutional structure by which media is created and produced and put out into the world. And there are efforts that we can do to make sure that structure is appropriately representing or at least considerate and sensitive to the communities that we're part of, even when we're not the ones writing the stories, right? The other thing that I find really important, again, coming from the perspective of being able to choose which of these projects I participate in, Chemical and Engineering News a couple years back did a project about Latino and Hispanic historic chemists that you should know about, right? And there was just something so often we're called to talk about our identities to kind of bear witness to the oppression or how poorly we are treated by society as a whole. And it was really nice to have an opportunity to write about people that I can be proud of, right? To write about joy and success, to as a representation of where my identity comes from, right? And so there's some nice kind of filling of the cup that comes from that makes it easier to pour later on when I'm called to do so. And I am really appreciative of being part of a newsroom that can appreciate that give and take.
Well said. Yeah, definitely the team effort. So I'll end. I know we're coming up on the hour with a question about that relationship with editors and newsrooms. If folks are listening and they want to give this a try for themselves, do you have any advice on approaching an editor about a story like this? And related to that, have you gotten any pushback from an editor on a pitch because you're too close to the subject, and how have you handled it? Any next steps advice for folks?
So I could say it's actually never happened to me. But I think if anything, it's been sometimes the other way around, like they want me to write something and I'm a little bit hesitant about it. But I know that it does happen. And I know that people do get pushed away from stories and told that they're too close to the topic. And the one thing I can think, which has worked even for the other side of the conversation, is to be very clear that this will not just be, me riffing on a topic. This has to be rooted in research. This has to be rooted in how I, my thought process, and that my experience informs this piece, but it is not the only thing in this piece. And that I think goes a long way to reassuring them, me, everybody involved, that this will be actually of interest to readers and it's not just self-indulgent.
I think I've been in a lot of predominantly white newsrooms where if I am, as a Native reporter, am interested in covering something that pertains to indigenous or Native matters, that I don't get a lot of pushback. I usually just simply am handed the keys and, they say, you're most familiar with this demographic culturally or on any number of levels. And so I've appreciated that. I am trusted. I don't think I've also necessarily been pigeonholed into doing a lot of coverage of Native America because I think people trust me and they want me to, follow where my interests go and where the story is. They trust my instincts. But I would say, that I would not mind if a non-Native journalist wanted to accompany me or at least do a debrief of the story afterwards and say, well, how did he approach us? And if I, as a non-Indian, wanted to cover the story, what advice would he have for me to approach the topic? I've given presentations and talks before on covering indigenous and Native communities for a number of media organizations, and there's a lot of fascination and a lot of curiosity as to how do you approach it without burning the bridge. And I think that that's something that is a good conversation to have in any newsroom, that maybe we individually are representatives of sorts of our community and our culture, but we also are educators as long as people express genuine interest in learning about it and doing their job better. So I'm kind of in a good position in that I have people who trust my work, don't push back, but also are very open to learning more about how they can cover it if I'm not available.
I've unfortunately received pushback before in my career on covering topics like that, which, for a lot of friends that I have in the business, this is not an uncommon experience, unfortunately. But what I have done to try and circumvent that or master that, I guess, is, whenever an editor says that to me, I try to understand, okay, if I'm too close, what are your misgivings? What are your concerns? Please explain that to me. If I'm pitching something, I don't just go to my editor with, a half-baked idea. I try to flesh it out as much as I can. These are the voices. These are the potential personal stories or anecdotes that I'm trying to find. These are the experts. This is the data. This is the research. Or if that's not accessible, this is what I'm trying to find with the FOIA or therefore, whatever. I try to lay out to show and demonstrate that this is something that I have clearly thought out, that this is something that could add value to our coverage, that this is something that we need to report, that this has nothing to do with me. This is just actually a good story. And that's the point of me fleshing out that pitch. You know, it's unfortunate that folks continue to face that, but I think that that's one way that you could kind of get around that, is to really try and bulletproof your pitch. And honestly, you know, if you are in a space where you are continuously receiving that sort of feedback, I also think that there's power in finding another place to go, another place that, you know, might be more supportive of the types of stories that you're trying to tell, if you're not able to you know, improve that relationship with the editor or the newsroom that you're facing. I just think that you know, there's power in that too.
All right, well, thank you all so much. I could have this conversation all night, but we're approaching the hour, and I know that Sam wants to wrap up with a couple of announcements. So thank you so much to each and every one of you. This has been fascinating, and I'm so glad that you were all able to join us tonight. And thank you all to those who have joined us at home, and for all of your wonderful questions as well. I'll throw it over to Sam.
Great. Thank you so much, Judy. And thank you to our 4 panelists this evening. Judy, do you mind just quickly sharing the slideshow once more?
Thank you for the reminder. Yes,
yeah.
Absolutely.
Great. So as you are probably aware, this is an event held by the DC Science Writers Association. If you are not a member of the DC Science Writers Association, we would love you to join us. We have a lot of events like this that are free, but we also have events that are for our specifically for our members, a lot of opportunities for networking. If you're in the DMV area, you know, we have a annual professional development day. Actually, we do it virtually now as well. So it's a hybrid event. So that you get a big discount on if you're a member, as well as our holiday party and a number of other things. And you get our monthly newsletter as well that tells you about all these upcoming events. Do you mind just going forward one? So for example, we have a happy hour that's coming up this Thursday for those of you in the area. And by this Thursday, sorry, that's confusing. Next Thursday, today is Wednesday. And then we also have a boat tour that's coming up on the Anacostia River that will be for DCSWA members. So again, you can go forward to the last one, Judy. Thank you. So if you are interested in becoming a member, student membership is only $10 for the full year. And for non-student membership, the regular membership is $45 for the whole year. And if you have any concerns, if you want to join, but you have any financial concerns, no questions asked, just email me, president@DC or at DCSWA, that's DCSWA.org, and I will waive it. No questions asked. So that's it for us this evening. Thank you so much, Judy, for being an incredible moderator and for organizing this event for DCSWA. Thank you, Brian, Ari, Kat, Apoorva. You're all wonderful. And I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of their afternoon, evening, wherever you're calling in from, and that we'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.